Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Raising the Bar. And as you know, I've been inviting on incredible thought leaders, and Ralph Ellis has caught my attention as someone that's doing some fabulous work, really debunking and bringing some truth and some light to some of the greatest deceptions out there at the moment. And there's one not bigger than the climate change topic. And Ralph has done this presentation before, and it's excellent. And I want you to get a cup of tea, sit back, invite your friends and your family to watch this with you, because we're really going to go through things, with a fine comb brush here. Ralph Ellis, how are you doing today, sir?
Very good. Thanks for having me on, John. Yeah, good to see you on this Sunday evening.
That's it. Yeah. And, this is an important topic, isn't it? And you spent a lot of time and you've researched this in depth. And I was wondering, Ralph, before we get into it, would you just like to give the audience a little brief bio into what led you to kind of, put so much effort into this topic?
Well, I've been at this quite a long time. I saw the propaganda when it first came out. So my first um, article really, but it was quite a long article I wrote in 2004,
Mm.
which was called Renewable Energy, Our Downfall. So
Mm.
it was unequivocal that renewable energy would not work and it would lead to higher costs, and it would lead to blackouts, power outages, as they call them in America. And it will be essentially the downfall of a technical civilization because we cannot operate without electricity. So I was writing this back in 2004. The green fantasists who are pushing this renewable energy are fantasists, and they won't broke any other real information. If you introduce real, and we'll see some of this in a minute in my presentation, when you introduce the real data, they will just deny it and delete it and whatever. I've had terrible problems trying to get some of this information across because the media will not give you this information, even though it is freely available. If you go onto the recognized websites for, NOAA, NCDC, and
Mm.
Rutgers Snow Lab, and so on, all of these reputable data sources, the media will not go to them and actually get the real data. So they're gaslighting everybody, basically. It's all
Yeah.
propaganda. There were 3 reports to government
Mm.
from the Royal Society, the Climate Change Committee, and from Oxford University. They were full of very basic errors. They couldn't even decide how much electricity we needed per annum,
Mm.
which is a basic thing. I mean, how much electricity are we going to need to generate? There was a 3-fold difference between these reports as to how much energy we're going to need. Well, that has a big bearing on how much you're going to have to build and how much it's going to cost if there's a 3-fold
Mm.
difference. And one of the reports couldn't even get the right energy units for storage of energy. They were
Mm.
using completely the wrong unit. It was like using um, it was like using miles. It was like using miles instead of miles per hour. That was
Unbelievable.
the basic error they made. So basically, some of these reports had just gone through the internet
Right.
and dug out snippets from the internet. You remember they were doing this with a 15 minutes for weapons of mass destruction,
Yeah,
and
of
it
course.
ended up as just internet searches. This
Mm.
really important document was just internet searches. Well, they're doing the same with climate, and this just a series of internet searches, and they'd copied the wrong data out of the wrong reference page on the internet.
By
And
no
so these
accident, though. By no accident, deliberately, I should imagine, right?
well, no, I think they're just stupid sometimes. I
Oh.
think they are utterly stupid. So these reports are very influential. They went to government. These are the reports that will build government policy on energy for the next 25, 30 years.
Is
So
that connected to the IPCC or not then?
no, this is merely energy. This is local. This is government. This is UK government.
Mm, okay.
So I did a report on each of these reports. I did a critique on them
Mm.
and sent it to all MPs in Westminster. Now, that's the only way you're going to change something. We can sit here talking forever, but unless you contact your representative and say, look, this is the real data, you're wrong on this, you're wrong on that, This is what's going to happen if you go down this road. Unless you contact your representatives and your media as well, whether it's national media or local media, and tell them how wrong all of this is, nothing will get done. Now, we have made a difference between myself and Paul Homewood and Dave Turver and other internet influencers, as it were, in this sort of market.
Mm.
One of them runs, not a lot of people know that, a website, and there's another one as well that's quite influential. We have started these different agencies making these reports, arguing amongst themselves. So they're now critiquing each other because we've set this ball in motion that they were wrong. And MPs now, politicians in the UK, are beginning to question these reports to government, which they would never have done before. So it is important to, contact people with media reach and your representatives in Parliament, to
Yeah, of course.
make them aware that
Pressure on them,
there's
yeah.
a lot of rubbish being spoken.
Absolutely.
And we'll see a lot of that rubbish in a minute. So this talk is Climate and Energy Misinformation by myself, Ralph Ellis. But this subject is being so badly taught, as we've just discussed. It's not misinformation, it's disinformation, because it's deliberate. So what do I know about climate? Well, this is my last climate paper, 5 years ago or so, modulation of ice ages by precession and dust albedo feedbacks. Very influential, 45,000 downloads, and fairly controversial because it says that CO2 is not the primary feedback agent controlling temperature. We're not going to look at this now. We're going to look at this in a separate talk in an hour or so. So that might come as a separate video. So watch out for that. It might be in a separate video. Yeah. Okay, this is from the paper. We're not going to talk about the paper here, but this is just one image from that paper, which is temperature versus CO2 during the ice ages. Temperature in red, CO2 in blue, and we've got 800,000 years of data here. So that's all of the major ice ages in the last million years. And you can see that the top is hot, obviously, the bottom is cold, and how big the temperature changes were during the ice ages. So you note here that temperature and CO2 are in lockstep together. Some climate scientists have erroneously presumed from that temperature is CO2 is controlling temperature, but correlation does not imply causation. You need a rationale for this causation. Alternatively, we can look at this graph, and every time CO2 is high, the world cools, and every time the world is every time CO2 is low, the world warms. So you could say high CO2 causes cooling and low CO2 causes warming. Now, it's more complex than that, of course, but you can see from this there are probably other factors involved in temperature control on the planet, because this would not happen if CO2 was a strong greenhouse gas. So we're going to look now at climate misinformation. And again, this is not misinformation, this is disinformation. How did this all start, this climate emergency? Well, it started with the hockey stick and hiding the decline. So this is the hockey stick graph by Professor Michael Mann. This is really what started all of this global warming alarmism. This was released back in 1997, I think, a long time ago. It's based on tree rings mostly. We've got 1,000 years of temperature data here, basically using tree rings as a proxy. But Michael Mann used a lot of the bristlecone pines, but on the bottom of the data set for bristlecone pines, it said, do not use for temperature proxies, because bristlecone pines are not a very good proxy for temperature. They're more affected by moisture than they are by temperature.
Is that how it was done? Sorry, Ralph. Is that how they worked out the hockey stick?
Yeah, this is all tree ring data, and tree rings. This is pseudoscience. This really is snake oil science, because tree rings are not a very good proxy for temperature. Um, and we can see that here in this tree. This is a bog standard tree that I just pulled off the internet. But any tree you cut down will be like this. Now, the wider the rings, the warmer the temperature. So they say. Um, so if we and when they do this, they core the tree. So they take a core which is only about 1 centimeter in diameter. But if you take a core in the 10 o'clock position, you'll find very wide rings, and it was very hot. But in the same tree, if you took that core in the 2 o'clock position, you would find that it's very small rings and it was very cold.
Mm.
So in this one tree, it was hot and cold at the same time, depending on where you take the core for this tree. And that's why tree ring temperature, tree ring thermology, I suppose you might call it, is pseudoscience, because there's too much variability, even within one tree, and you'll see variability within one forest, let alone telling you the entire global temperature from a single tree ring on the Sierra Nevada in America, which is the bristlecone pine, which you're not supposed to use for dendrothermology, because it's not a very good proxy for temperature, because being up in the high Sierra Nevada, trees are more affected by moisture than they are by temperature. I mean, you think about it. What makes a tree grow? Nutrients, canopy cover, rainfall, of course. And at the very bottom, you might find temperature as a factor. But it's not the primary factor. So you can't take temperatures from tree rings. It's nonsense.
Don't they also
anyway,
take it from? Don't they also take from satellite observations, ocean-based data?
Ocean-based, yeah, not satellite, of course. This is going 1,000 years into the past. But yeah, for modern ones, they do satellite. Yeah, they do take it from ocean sediments as well, and they put those in. But most of they're coming into the fore now. But in 1997, with this hockey stick graph, it was pretty much all tree rings.
Okay.
But this is the graph that caused the entire climate emergency. And so you end up with this hockey stick. So the temperature bubbles along for about 950 years until you get to the end, into the 20th century, and suddenly the temperature rockets up, and we're all going to fry, apparently. How did this get written? Well, it was by hiding the decline, and this is an email from the ClimateGate emails as to how they made these graphs. And it says down the bottom here, it says, "I've just completed Mike's nature trick." So Mike is Professor Michael Mann, climate scientist, of course. Nature is the journal Nature. And he says, "I've just completed Mike's nature trick of adding in the real temperatures to each series for the last 20 years, from 1981 onwards, and from 1961 for Keith Briffa's data, in order to hide the decline." So what was this trick, and what was the decline they were trying to hide? Well, we can see what they were trying to do from Keith Briffa's data, and this is Keith Briffa's climate data. Again, taken from tree rings. He's got 600 years of tree ring data here. And this is widely regarded as one of the better tree ring series, but it's not very good because it's managed to delete the Little Ice Age, of course. That doesn't exist anymore. And you can see the temperature bobbles along with not much happening until we get to the 20th century. And the temperature declines. The temperature goes down. So it doesn't go up in the 20th century, it goes down. And that is the decline. And what do they call this? Well, they call this the the divergence problem. So the divergence problem says that tree rings record temperature very precisely for hundreds of years until you get to 1950, and then they stop recording temperature in 1950. That's the divergence problem. That's a real problem from climate science. So what do you do if you find a divergence problem, a decline in temperatures?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the answer is obvious. You just chop off the end of the graph and you stitch in the thermometer data, and you've got a hockey stick. And that's how they created the hockey stick graph. That's why it's got a different color on the end of the graph. So this graph is a stitch between two different data sets. It's a stitch up, really. Because if trees cannot record temperature reliably in the 20th century, how can they be relied upon to give you temperature in the past? It's just a nonsense.
Mm.
And yet this was the very start of the IPCC reports. This came out in one of the very first AR1, I think it was, of the IPCC reports.
So what should that look like then? It should dip down instead of going up.
Yeah, in Keith Briffa's data, yes.
Yeah.
In Keith Briffa's data, the tree ring data went down. Now, in man's data, because this is a compendium of 3 or 4 different tree ring data sets, in man's data, the temperatures started going up slightly in the 20th century. But as they were saying in the recent court case, Stein v. Mann, a very famous recent court case just last week, Mann's data set was manipulated by the statistical method he was using to create his graph, whereby you could influence what the graph was going to say. And his methodology, his statistical methodology, searched out for rising temperatures and reproduced them and exaggerated them into hockey sticks anyway. Which is why you see some of the blue rises towards the right-hand side, because you could put red noise data through his analysis and it would still come out with a hockey stick. So it was a very biased form of analysis of the data in the first place. So there were many, many criticisms. That's why this graph was taken away from the IPCC reports after AR3, I think it was. It was actually deleted from the reports because it was so unreliable. So yeah, it was hugely controversial, but it's still used today as an
of course it is, yeah,
example of global warming in the 20th century. And this sort of manipulation of the data has gone on ever since. It just never stops. You've probably seen this already, UK weather maps, how they have changed over the years. So here's some BBC weather maps. So which is the warmer temperatures? Well, the ones on the left-hand side, of course. What's the difference? Well, the one on the left-hand side is from 15 years ago. The one on the right is from modern times. And they've decided to color everything red to make it look as though it's really, really hot. But of course, the one on the left has the warmer temperatures. It's a form of gaslighting, basically.
Yeah.
We get it in tornado numbers. People obviously probably have an idea about what's happening to tornadoes. They're getting worse. They're getting more frequent. They're destroying communities all over North America. So let's have a look at the data. This comes from NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration in America. So this is the go-to site for data on tornadoes. And this is 70 years of tornado data, F3 to F5, so the strong tornadoes. And you can see that the number of strong tornadoes has been decreasing for 70 years. And if people didn't know that, Why didn't they know that? Why is this not headline news in all of the media outlets? We get the same with tropical cyclones. So we all know what's happening with tropical cyclones. They're getting worse. They're getting stronger, and coastal communities are being wiped out all over the world. Well, let's look at the data. This comes from Dr. Ryan Mao. Cyclone frequency over 40 years, well, 44 years now, I suppose you might say it is. And all hurricanes and cyclones, hurricanes and typhoons on the top, and they have been decreasing slightly for 40 years. And the major ones, the strong ones, well, no change in 40 years. So again, people might not know this. And if you didn't know this, why not? Why is this not headline news? And where is the climate emergency? They're saying we've got to do all of this mitigation, spending all of this money to go net zero because these things are getting worse. And of course, you look at the data and it's not getting worse. And we have the same from Chand et al. This was a paper in 2022, and it was looking at past frequency of tropical cyclones, and they took this back to 1850 using proxy data. And you can see that from 1850, the number of cyclones increased until 1900, and they have been decreasing ever since for 120 years. Okay, and decreasing by about 15%, which is quite reasonable. So the number of tropical cyclones has actually been reducing, not increasing. Again, there is no climate emergency in this data. Same with snow extent. You remember the quote from Dr. David Viner of the CRU in East Anglia. He said, our children will not know what snow is because of global warming. Well, let's look at the data. This is Northern Hemisphere snow extent from Rutgers Snow Lab. Again, this is the go-to site for real information and data on snowfall from Rutgers University, basically in America. And you can see Northern Hemisphere winter snow extent, basically no change really. In what have we got? We've got 50 years of data there. No change in 50 years. So again, not what people are being told, I imagine. Polar temperatures and ice sheets, well, we've got a mixed bag here. So this is a look at temperatures. And as you know, what's happening? Well, the Arctic is boiling apparently, or something like that. I don't know. So the top one is Arctic. So temperatures have been increasing in the Arctic. They've increased by 1 degree in 40 years. There might be other reasons for that. We'll look at that in a minute. But down in Antarctica, no change. No change in 40 years. This data is from UAH, which is University of Alabama, Huntsville, run by Dr. John Christie. So this is, again, the go-to site for real information on this. So what's this doing to sea ice? Well, we all know what's happening to sea ice. It's all disappearing. The poles will be free of sea ice, by, well, I think they said by 2007.
I think Al Gore said something like that, didn't he?
Yeah, then he said 2015.
Yeah, that's right.
Then he said 2020. Yeah, and it's still not free.
But Ralph, it must be right because I've seen a polar bear hanging on for dear life on a on a bit of ice.
We'll have a look at that polar bear in a minute.
Yeah.
So this is the sea ice page. This comes from the NSIDC, which is the National Snow and Ice Data Center in America. The blue one is Arctic, and as you can see, the Arctic sea ice has been decreasing, but is now increasing. Okay. And it's decreased by 20%. You might say that's a problem. 20%, that's just variability, really. There's a lot of cyclical data in this information. But in Antarctica, people probably don't know this, Antarctic sea ice was increasing for 35 years. until we had a couple of big storms down in Antarctica, and now it has started decreasing. But the main thing I suppose to note here is the disparity here between the Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere. Why are they at odds with each other? CO2 is a global gas. It tends to have global effects, one would have thought. But here we see the Northern and Southern Hemispheres in opposition to each other. Mm. So what else could be affecting polar temperatures? Well, another possibility, which comes from my research, is actually albedo, industrial dust on Arctic ice. So this is the Arctic. This comes from the Dark Snow project, which was running in about 2012. And they were trying to record the reflectivity of the ice. Because obviously the darker the ice, the more it will absorb sunlight and therefore have a greater tendency to melt. And so the Arctic was not as pristine as you might think. Whereas, of course, the Antarctic is not affected by this, because this was soot from a few fires in Canada, and this was Chinese industrial dust from the globalization of China as an industrial society. So there are other possibilities that may well affect temperatures in the polar regions. And that brings us on to the old polar bears, because they are the canary in the coal mine for the climate industry. They were the primary symbol, of the climate industry. And this is a quote from the BBC: "Polar bears will be wiped out by the end of the century unless more is done to tackle climate change." This is from 2020. Now, this is pure disinformation, because the BBC must have known the true numbers of polar bears in the Arctic. But they chose to give you disinformation, not the real information. Well, this is the real information. This comes from Dr. Susan Crockford. And we've got 60 years of data here on polar bear numbers, and polar bear numbers have been increasing for 60 years. Not only increasing, they have quadrupled in 60 years. So where is the being wiped out, as the BBC would have it, in this data?
And also, you said the ice covering was increased, right? Before.
No, this is the Arctic, so it has decreased. But, to say that polar bears will be wiped out because of a lack of ice is nonsense, because polar bears have been around for 5 million years or more, who knows. But only 8,000 years ago, during the Holocene maximum, temperatures in the polar regions was 2 degrees warmer than now. There probably was no ice at all during the Holocene maximum, which is only 8,000 years ago. And we know that the Holocene maximum was much warmer than now, because the taiga forest in Siberia was 200 kilometers further north, because it was so much warmer. So that's a guaranteed piece of data that it was warmer during the Holocene maximum, which was mainly caused by the obliquity of the Earth's axis, which is a very, very slow change in climate. It takes 40,000 years to change. But yeah, this is hogwash, because polar bears survived quite happily through several ice ages and through the Holocene maximum. If they can survive all of the ice ages, they're not going to be put off by a little bit of a lack of sea ice. They're obviously very adaptable creatures. Well, food production. While I was producing this, I saw lots of commentary on videos saying that, and on the television as well, saying due to global warming, there will be mass famine. I think this was Greta the Gremlin was saying this.
Goblin, yeah.
Yeah, Greta the Goblin. She was saying this, that we're all going to starve because of global warming reducing food production. Well, let's look at food production numbers. This comes from United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. I hope they know what they're talking about down there at the UN. Um, they've probably got tunnels underneath their headquarters. Who knows nowadays? But anyway, this is food production, world food production. And the main one is the red one, of course, cereals. And then we've got sugars. That's slightly reducing, but that's mainly due to taste. We're not eating as much sugar as we used to. Everything is actually increasing. So there is no climate emergency in food production. More than that, the increase that we see here, and it's quite a big increase as well, from 2 billion, looking at the cereals, 2 billion tons up to 3 billion. We're talking about a 50% increase here in 20 years. This is a big increase. Most of this increase is actually caused by extra CO2. So the extra CO2 in the atmosphere is actually helping agriculture. It is not hindering it. We'll see this in a minute because I've got a graph on that as well. But if you mention this in polite society, they will shout at you. Well, 97% of climate scientists agree with anthropogenic global warming. But of course, that's hogwash as well. They didn't. So where did this data come from? Well, it came from this paper by John Cook et al. There's another paper come out recently by Proctor et al., which has the same problems. It was accused of data manipulation and circular reasoning and God knows what. So all of these, I think there's been 3 of these papers on the proportion of scientists who agree, and they all have the same problems. So what did they do to get these figures? Well, they took 12,000 climate papers, and 66% of them expressed no opinion. So they threw those out of the window. Of the remainder, 3% of papers with an opinion rejected global warming. Ergo, you might say, 97% of papers with an opinion supported global warming. That's where the 97% comes from. But that's not what it said. If you dig in deeper to the data, and remember, they did not append the data to their paper, so it had to be got by a Freedom of Information Act to get the data. But anyway, I think this was Lord Monckton and his group managed to get the data, and it turned out that only 24% of these papers supported global warming. Now, myself as a CO2 realist, I would have to be a 24%er because there has been some warming. We don't quite know what's causing it, and we don't know its magnitude. But there has been some warming. So I would have to put myself down as a 24%er, even as a climate realist. And then we can go on, and they found that only 8% of these papers implicitly endorsed anthropogenic global warming, that it was mankind's fault. And only 0.5% explicitly supported the IPCC version of anthropogenic global warming. So it was not 97%, it was 0.5%. Yeah. So again, we see they are being very deceptive as usual. And the problem here being that all climate scientists are paid to agree with anthropogenic global warming. And he that pays the piper calls the tune. And if you don't go along with that tune, then you get dismissed, like these climate scientists were dismissed from their jobs. So this is the problem, not just with climate science, but mainly with climate science, but in a lot of academia nowadays, that there is no freedom of research, no freedom of speech, no freedom of publication within modern academia. You have to go along with the agenda, otherwise you lose your job. And in the case of Michael Mann recently in the court case, you will get sued So he ended up suing a news reporter for saying that the hockey stick graph was a load of rubbish. And he made a comparison with some of the goings on in Penn University. Now, that reporter has been fined $1 million
Mm.
for writing a report about Michael Mann's hockey stick graph. And this is the problem. You cannot step out of the sort of global agenda because there will be opposition forces trying to destroy you. And that's what they do. During the trial, he was not trying to argue the merits of his hockey stick graph. All he wanted to do was to cancel this reporter and therefore cancel the journal that he worked for, which was they called a right-wing journal. But it's not really. It was just a realist journal that didn't go along with the climate agenda, basically. And they wanted to destroy that journal, which they may have done because they were fined $1 million.
Mm.
That's how modern science is actually working at present.
They've thought a lot about this with the 97, 97% effective, the jab and all that kind of stuff. 97% of climate scientists.
Yeah, it's manipulated,
Yeah,
isn't
of
it?
course it
It's
is.
not real. um, which shows the state of modern science, that it's come down to, propaganda. It's not proper science at all anymore.
So how can I just, in terms of, instead of the percent, in actual numbers wise, what does that 0.5% look like in numbers wise?
64. So in brackets after
Oh
the
yeah, you've
half
got it in
percent.
bracket.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. 60,
64 as opposed to how many didn't believe the
12,000.
so 12,000 believed there was no anthropogenic man-made climate change.
Oh, no, I mean, that was a bit of manipulation. There were
Yeah.
12,000 papers.
Yeah.
118 papers rejected global warming completely. But I mean, who would do that? Because we know there's been a little
Yeah.
bit of warming. The question is not has there been warming, but what is actually causing the warming?
Mm.
Is it mankind's fault, anthropogenic, or is it just natural? Because there are many cycles
Yeah.
within within the climate. The main ones that they're disregarding, of course, is they're looking at CO2 all the time. They're disregarding oceanic cycles, for instance, the AMO and the PDO, the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation and the Pacific decadal oscillation. Now, they are big oceanic changes in temperature in the oceans, which do affect, obviously, temperature on land. And they work on like a 60-year cycle, 60, 70-year cycle. And we happen to have been in a warming cycle of the AMO and PDO oceanic cycles since the 1980s. And they're just starting to go back into the cooling regime. So the PDO has already gone into cooling mode.
What's
The
PDO?
AMO,
Sorry. What's PDO? Sorry.
Pacific decadal.
What does that mean in normal, in layman's terms?
Pacific decadal oscillation. It's just a change in the circulation patterns around the Pacific. And then there's a similar one around the Atlantic, the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation.
Okay.
Now the AMO is at the peak of its warmest period, as it were, in this 60-year cycle. And it's about to go back into sort of cold mode. So it's possible that all of the warming we've seen since sort of 1980, 1990 has all been due to the AMO. And it's about to go back into cold mode. So, and this was one of the fears in the ClimateGate emails. There was a famous ClimateGate email that said, I hope that all of this warming since 1990 is not just oceanic cycles, otherwise they'll hang us all. Yeah, maybe we shall.
Yeah. That could happen still, yeah.
That could happen still.
Yeah, yeah.
Because remember, there was this big thing recently in the newspapers that January was the warmest January on record, headline news. What they didn't tell you is that China has had the coldest winter on record. So in like 150 years of Chinese data, this was the coldest winter they've had, December and January, on record. So has Finland. Finland had the coldest December on record. So yeah, okay, they might be saying warming at present because we're in an El Nino, of course, that tends to make things warmer anyway. But that doesn't mean that this warming was spread all over the world. We've had some very cold temperatures this winter.
Is that not also the trick, Ralph, that they used to call it global warming, and then they realised, well, the temperature's very, the temperature's all kind of very variable, so it's all very arbitrary. So we'll call it climate change. So when it's cold, it's climate change, and when it's warm, it's climate change. They covered all bases, haven't they, with the
Yeah,
rebrand?
and then they called it climate catastrophe and various other things, and now it's global boiling.
Global
They're
warming.
running out of superlatives.
Yes.
What's it going to be next? The
Yeah.
global furnace.
Yeah. Oh, don't give them ideas.
Yeah, I mean it's all alarmism, isn't it? That's
Yeah, of
what they're
course it
doing.
is.
They're,
So
they're
just to go back to this, Ralph, just quickly. So only 64 actually believe that the official IPCC narrative about man-made global warming,
yes, out of
climate change,
12,000.
out of 12,000, 64 out of 12,000. And then the others, you say it's difficult to say how many rejected it because the temperatures have gone up. It's not overtly putting resistance up to that 0.5%, is it?
Yeah, the 0.5 is a ridiculous figure because the IPCC version is the most extreme that they could possibly come across. They're talking about up to 7 degrees of warming for a doubling of CO2, which is utterly absurd.
Yeah.
If you look at John Christie's data, he says 1.1 degree. He's using satellite data, not surface data, from the troposphere. And he says 1.1 degree for a doubling of CO2. Now, that is not a problem. We can survive that very easily without any mitigation whatsoever. So, yeah, how much warming are we going to get? They haven't even decided that, really. That's why the 0.5% figure is ridiculous. You've got to be an uber greenie in order to agree with that one. The best one, I suppose, is 24%, which is 2,900 papers supported global warming in general, but didn't differentiate between anthropogenic and just natural. So I would be in that category because I would say there has been some warming, but the vast majority of it is natural. Only a very, very little of it is actually man-made.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, we talk about what you think has caused the warming.
Well, I think there's a lot of it is caused by Chinese industrial dust on the Arctic ice sheets. Because that's what my climate paper says. My climate paper says the primary feedback agent controlling temperature is dust, not CO2. So there's a huge, great difference there. So just because you observe warming does not mean that it was CO2 doing the warming.
That's interesting that you still think it's like
else.
That is technically a man-made intervention, though, isn't it? Like
that's man-made, but there's no point trying to get rid of CO2 if CO2 is not the problem.
Yeah.
You want to get rid of Chinese industrial dust.
you wouldn't put it down to like sunspot activity, like the
No, I think the best analysis of the sunspot idea was Willis Eschenbach, who's a mathematician, and he was just doing statistical analyses of all of the data, and he could not get a statistical significance to the 11-year sunspot cycle. That doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't have an effect, because recently there was a paper that came out that said there was a good correlation between sunspot cycles and the tropical cyclone activity. Now, the problem is with making those correlations is we don't have enough data. We've only got 40 years of satellite data in order to make that correlation. So we've only got like 3 points of commonality. 40 years of data, and the sunspot cycle is 11 years. So we don't have enough data to say that that is significant. But it could be that
Mm.
sunspot cycles are affecting the cyclone data, although we don't have a rationale for that. That there's no reasoning for why that should be.
Mm. Okay.
Because remember, during the sunspot cycle, the TSI, the total solar index, the amount of energy coming from the sun, does not change. The only
Right.
thing that changes is the magnetism.
Mm.
It's the magnetic cycle that
Yeah.
changes during the sunspot cycle. Now, that can have an effect on Earth because it affects the geomagnetism of the Earth itself.
Mm.
And so that could have an effect on weather. They've been doing some work. Svensmark was doing some work on that to see whether that would make an effect because it changes the amount of cosmic rays that are impacting the Earth.
Mm.
And that could have a seeding effect on clouds. So that could have an effect on climate. But that is all unknown because we still don't have enough data, we don't have enough information, and we've not done enough experimentation on that, mainly because everyone is 100% concerned with CO2 and they're not looking at any other possibilities. Now, there are other possibilities. My Albedo, for instance, the
Mm.
Dark Snow Project
Mm.
got together in 2011, I think it was, and they went out surveying for the albedo of the ice sheets. Now, they were not looking at CO2, of course, so they had their funding cut and they weren't allowed to do it again because they ran out of money. So this is the problem with concentrating on CO2. They're not looking at anything else. They're not looking at oceanic cycles. They're not looking at solar magnetism, and they're not looking at oceanic cycles, ice sheet albedo.
Mm.
Yeah, all of those different other things that could be affecting climate, and they're just not looking at it.
Yeah.
Which is a shame because
Mm.
I mean, how are you going to know if you don't look at all of the possibilities?
Yeah.
It's
Well, they don't want
absurd.
us to, do they? Clearly, they want to hold us in this particular paradigm way of thinking, and
Yeah,
yeah, of
but
course.
it's absurd. The climate is not controlled by one climate knob, the
Mm.
CO2 knob. That's absurd to think that something as complex as the climate is controlled by one control knob.
And is it
Of course,
worth just for the audience just saying like how small amount of man-made CO2 there is in the atmosphere? Like break it
yeah.
down.
There's only 400 parts per million. We'll go into that in a minute,
Yeah. Okay.
which is only 0.04%
Mm.
of the total atmosphere. So yeah, it's only a very small amount. And of course, the greatest of the climate of the greenhouse gases is
Mm.
actually water vapor,
Yeah, I was going to say. Yeah.
which represents something like 80% of the effect is through water vapor, not through CO2.
And the CO2 comes after the warming anyway. Like you'd warm a bottle of soda, and then you get the it come the
Mm.
CO2 release is after, not before.
Yeah, I mean, that's another factor, of course. The amount of CO2 that's been increasing,
Mm.
and it has been increasing, of course, they are putting that all down to man's emissions.
Mm.
But as you're saying, as the seas have warmed, and the seas have warmed a little, it will outgas CO2.
Mm.
And therefore, some of the, probably at least half of the CO2 increase we have seen is due to outgassing from the oceans,
What do you
not
mean by
through.
outgassing? What does that mean, outgas?
With the warmer the water,
Yeah.
the less CO2 it can hold in the water. And so it outgasses, like, as you
Like
say, opening a soda bottle.
coming out.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, in a soda bottle, you're releasing the CO2 by releasing the pressure on it.
Mm.
But the same will happen if you warm up the bottle. More and more CO2 will come out of the soda
Mm.
if you warm the soda up. And that's what happens to the oceans. The warmer the oceans get, the more CO2 comes out into the atmosphere.
But what do you think
We
is warming the oceans then?
Well, it could be oceanic cycles. It could be ice sheet albedo. Because in my climate paper, which we're going to
Mm.
look at next, all of that warming came about through ice sheet albedo.
Okay, that's
not through
terminology. I've
CO2.
got no idea what that
Um,
means. So.
re- Reflectivity of the ice, how dark or bright the ice
How
is,
much is it absorbed and how much is
and
reflected?
how much it's reflecting. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Because that makes a huge difference. If you've got an
Yeah.
enormous great ice sheet, and we're going to look at this in the next talk, coming all the way down to 52 degrees north, a vast ice sheet covering the northern hemisphere. If that's all white and
Yep.
reflecting the sun's rays, all of that energy disappears. We don't even get it on the Earth. It doesn't even arrive here, really. It's just reflected straight back out into space.
Oh, so
So that has an
if it gets absorbed because it's darker, it's black, it's kind of
mm,
the heat's absorbed. This is like basic science lessons from some school that everyone should have done. Are we saying then that what's the scientific term? It transfers to the oceans that way. It
yeah,
conducts,
because it'll
right?
melt the snow and that
Yeah.
water will go down into the oceans and it will warm the oceans and it will
Okay.
warm the land because you've got now warmer oceans. So that energy stays on the earth because
Mm.
it's been used to ablate and melt the ice. That energy is now in the earth's energy system.
Right. Okay.
And so yeah, it makes a big
Mm.
effect if you can darken all of the ice sheets in the north. It makes a huge great effect on how much energy is being absorbed from the sun.
I'm just trying to think though.
Um,
If you melt it, it's gonna enter into the water at the same temperature.
well, no, I mean the ice can be minus 20 degrees,
Mm.
but the water has got to be above zero. So you've increased the temperature of water by 20 degrees, and also you've increased its energy state because water is strange. It has a very great latent heat of melting. So the latent heat of melting for ice is huge. So to go from like minus a half a degree
Mm.
of ice in centigrade, of course, for Americans, to
Mm.
go from minus a half a degree to plus half a degree takes an enormous amount of energy because of the latent heat of melting
Mm.
of ice to water. And so all of that energy has now gone into that liquid and it will hold on to that energy. So if you want to freeze that ice, say in the winter, you have to take all of that energy back out again in order to make it back into ice, which is a huge amount of energy.
Mm.
So you're putting a lot of energy into the climate system by melting the ice. And of course, once you've melted the ice, now the land that is exposed, that can absorb energy as well because the ice sheets are retreating. And now you've got open land
Mm.
and open
Are they
oceans.
retreating though, would you say?
And no, I'm talking about during the ice ages.
Yeah, okay, right, yeah.
Yeah, they're not really retreating at
Mm.
present. So,
Mm.
um, but the um, the sea ice is in the north, so the sea ice has decreased by 20%. So that's made a lot more open ocean, which
Mm.
is now absorbing sunlight as well. Because obviously oceans absorb um, a lot more energy than white ice will.
Mm.
So again, you're warming the entire system if you cover all of the polar region with dust or
Mm.
Chinese industrial dust.
Okay.
So yeah, they want to go net zero by 2050. Now they've got two goals at present. They want to go all electric. Sorry, they want to go all renewable for electricity by 2035. And this is almost across the Western world. I don't know who's
Mm.
controlling this. Across all of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Americas, they all want to go all renewable electricity by 2035. And they want to go all electric renewable by 2050, including transport, heating, and industry as well.
Mm.
So those are the two goals that they want to achieve. And what do I think about this? Well, I support responsible net zero with an emphasis on the responsible, because they're not being responsible whatsoever at present. Why do I say this? Well, It's not because CO2 is a problem. I don't believe CO2 is a problem. It's because we, especially in Britain, we're talking mostly about Britain now, will run out of fossil fuels. So Britain hit peak coal in 1913. That's over a century ago. It was peak production of coal. We hit peak oil in 1999 and we hit peak gas in 2002. We don't have in Britain enough fossil fuels to keep on burning fossil fuels
Really?
without being dependent.
Do you
Yeah.
believe? Because I thought maybe that was another kind of made up thing, like a
Oh,
myth.
no, no. If you look at the stats for oil production, all of the big fields have gone, all of the Brents have gone.
Yeah.
And now we're using lots and lots of very thin little oil fields that are only giving a little bit of oil. That's why we're no longer an oil exporter, apart from because some of our oils are quite sweet, and so we'll export those because they're more expensive and import some of the cruder stuff.
Mm.
But yeah, we're running out of oil, we're running out of gas. We've squandered most of it already. In the space of, what, 50 years, we've squandered most of it. And we never set up a national investment site, to invest this money for future usage. So, yeah, we've wasted it all, basically.
Mm.
So if we want to carry on burning fossil fuels, we will have to start importing it. And that will mean being dependent on other nations like North Africa,
Yeah.
like the Middle East. Do you really want to be dependent on these regions?
Mm.
Like Russia, look what's happened to Russian supplies recently. Look what's happened to Germany, who was like 50% dependent on Russian gas and suddenly can't get any.
Mm.
That's the problem. So we do need to be looking for alternate energy supplies, and so does the world, because if we can run out of fossil fuels, so will the world eventually, whether it's in 100 years, 200 years, or whatever, if we look into the far future. Remember, 100 years is not very much. If the Victorians had used up all of our oil and gas during the Victorian era, we would have nothing now. That was only 100 years ago. 100 years passes very fast in sort of national terms. So we need to be looking for alternate energy supplies, and we might look at those in a minute. But regards CO2, we need more CO2, not less.
Mm.
Why?
Plant
Because of
food.
these plants.
Yeah.
So the unspoken truth is that CO2 is plant food.
There you go.
So what's the difference between these plants? Well, CO2, of course, those on the left have lots of CO2, those on the right have very little. Now, yeah, so in which case CO2 is the most essential gas in the atmosphere. Without CO2, all life on Earth will die. It's that stark. So we need CO2. We're sitting here at 400 parts per million, and the plants are doing reasonably well.
Mm.
But if we had more CO2, the plants would do even better. That's why agricultural production is increasing at present, because of the extra CO2 we've got in the atmosphere. But if you're a greenhouse grower, some of the greenhouse growers pump their CO2 up to 2,000 parts per million to make the plants grow quicker. So more CO2 is good for the biosphere. And let's not let any uneducated teenagers tell us otherwise. Conversely, during the last ice age, CO2 came down to 190 parts per million. Now, that was a problem because up on the highlands of China, the equivalent parts per million of CO2 came down to 150 parts per million equivalent. And as you can see on the right-hand side, the plants were dying. So low CO2 equals plant death, which equals CO2 deserts. Now, everyone is familiar with precipitation deserts. You get no rain, there's no plants, you get a desert. Same happens with CO2. If you don't have enough CO2, all the plants die, you get a CO2 desert. Climate scientists don't like that term, CO2 desert, because it brands CO2 as what it really is, which is plant food. it's the most essential gas in the atmosphere. Conversely, during the Jurassic era, CO2 was 2,500 parts per million,
Mm.
which is 6 times higher than now. And in fact, we could say that the large size of dinosaurs was in part due to extra CO2, because CO2 equals bigger plants, equals bigger herbivores, equals bigger um, bigger carnivores. I was trying to remember the name there.
Mm.
So yeah, extra CO2 is good for the biosphere. Yeah.
And also, I don't know if
And
you know, Africa used to be a lot more um, lush with grasslands. Like the Sahara was actually lush grasslands, and they even had ice
yes,
covering in South Africa at one
yeah,
point.
this was during the Holocene maximum, so 8,000 years ago. The Sahara was green and fertile.
Yeah.
Now, it's not entirely clear why that happened.
Mm.
Now, at that time, the Holocene maximum was governed by obliquity of the Earth, was at its maximum. So the leaning angle of the Earth was at its maximum. And therefore, you will get warmer temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere, which is what happened.
Mm.
So the Holocene maximum was much warmer at the poles by 2 degrees. But I saw a recent paper which was saying that the greening of the Sahara was governed by precession, the precession of the equinox,
Mm.
which is the wobble of the Earth. So the Earth wobbles on its axis like this. It's
Mm.
got a 26,000 year wobble, which in climatic terms comes down to 23,000. We'll look at this in the next talk. 23,000 years. And the Sahara seems to green every 23,000 years as if it is connected to the precessional cycle. But I've not seen an explanation as to why that would be so. I can see why
Mm.
it would be linked to the obliquity cycle, but I don't know why it would be so much connected with the precessional cycle.
Okay.
So yes, the bottom line there is the Sahara might not have greened just because it was warmer. It might have greened because of the orbital cycles of the Earth.
Okay.
And those are not necessarily connected directly.
Hmm.
So that's the end
Mm.
of that.
Can I ask you about the forest fires then?
Oh, yes. So we have some alternate. I did dig these out
I
earlier.
mean, data aside, just the basic science of it, surely, if you blow out a candle, that's carbon dioxide, that's, you're denying the oxygen, right? If you want more fire, you have more oxygen. So how would an increase in carbon dioxide create
Oh, well,
fire?
they're saying that increased. Oh, I've got to come out of share because I need to share
Mm.
a different one. That they're saying that increased CO2
Mm.
is warming the planet, and therefore increased warming means a higher probability of forest fires because it's hot and the forests are dry, and therefore they're going to burn easier.
But surely,
But
surely it comes down to not the temperature, but it comes down to humidity, right?
yeah, there's many other factors. That's the
Yeah, there's
problem.
many other factors.
Um, the factor that Trump was saying, which many other people have said,
Yeah.
and everyone said, "Oh, he's stupid again," as they always do.
Mm.
Um, the other problem is forest management. If you
Mm.
don't clear the forest, because back in the 20s and 30s, they had this big program of forest management where you clear off
Mm.
the litter from the trees. Because if you let the fuel load build up in the trees, in between the trees,
Mm.
then when you do get a fire, the fire goes out of control.
Yeah.
If you have no fuel load, they call it, litter underneath the trees, then what you get is a fire that just runs through the forest and doesn't burn anything, because you're only getting little flames. Flames may be just a meter high, and of course they don't touch the trees. They just burn
Mm.
the litter down below the tree, and that's it. But if you've got a huge, great fuel load there underneath the tree, you get massive flames and they burn the entire tree and they burn the entire forest. So forest management is key on this. And as you say, moisture is another problem.
Mm.
I suppose they were saying that in a way, in that they were saying that places like California
Mm.
are going to have an everlasting drought. But of course, for the last like 4 years, they've had an everlasting flood down in
Yeah.
California. So, I mean,
Mm.
they want it both ways.
Yeah.
They want, if it's dry, that's global warming.
Mm.
If you've got a flood, well, that must be global warming, surely.
Yeah. That's why they
Heads they
changed it to
win.
climate change, hence the rebrand.
Yeah, heads they win, tails you lose.
Yeah.
But in truth, if we look at, since we're talking about California, if we look at now, I've got to share screen again. So where are
Mm.
you? You're up there. If I share screen and share that one. Okay, so this is US forest fire burn acreage since 1926, and this comes from the NIFC, which is the government, US government fire forestry service. And as you can see from this graph goes from 1926 all through to 2020. So this is quite recent data.
Mm.
And the number of fires they had back in the 1920s, 30s was huge. It's like 10 times more
Mm.
than they had in the 70s and 80s. This enormous great peak in the 20s and 30s on the left-hand side. Is that showing up? Can you see
Yeah,
that?
yeah. Why do you think that was then?
Well, because there was less. Two reasons that have been given. One group of people say a lot of this was controlled burning. So it wasn't rampant, it wasn't uncontrolled natural forest fires. It was controlled burns,
Mm.
which you should do, of course, if you want to stop forest fires. The other school of thought is that they weren't controlling forests very well at this stage, and you had a lot of open forest fires, natural forest fires. So you had this enormous amount of burnt acreage in America up until the 1950s. And then you had very little. Now, what they do nowadays is they say, oh, look, forest fires are increasing.
Mm.
And they start the measurement from about the 1990s or the
Yeah.
1980s. And then, of course, you'll see, oh, it has been rising. Yeah, okay. If you measure it from the 1980s, if you're into cherry picking, which they are, yeah, of course, forest fires have been increasing since the 1980s. But the reasons many people give for that is that there has been not enough forest management. Because the Greens said, oh, you can't clear the litter away under the trees because that's natural litter. What can the
Mm.
bugs do? What can the small animals do? You've got to leave the litter under the trees for all of the insects.
Mm.
Yeah, but then when you do get a fire, you get a big fire and it burns the entire forest down. So a lack of forest management means a lot more big burns of forests. And the Greens don't understand that. They live in this fantasy world that everything is natural is good. No, nature is cruel sometimes.
Mm.
Sometimes, yeah, if you just leave the litter on the ground, you end up with an enormous great fire. And then they complain about it and say, oh, look, it's burning all the towns down.
Mm.
Yeah, but you've built the town in the forest. Of course, there's been a big expansion of construction in the forestry regions, especially in California. And they leave the trees instead of having a huge, great fire break between the forest and the town. They want to live in tune with nature, because these are all greenies. So they want the forest surrounding them so they can be in tune with nature. Yeah, but now you don't have a fire break. If you get a fire, it
Mm.
just runs through your town. And so that town in California got completely wiped out.
Mm. And there's
But it was,
and there's people that have been convicted of arson as well.
oh, yeah, a lot.
Yeah.
Yes,
Mm.
especially in the recent one. I think the recent Australian one, I think all of the fires there in
Mm.
Australia were actually set by arsonists.
And and Canada as well.
Yeah. And I think now they've not disclosed why and who, but one gets the impression that these are greenies who want to discredit or want to promote global warming, and therefore they want to promote forest fires.
Yeah.
And I think that's done as a part of the agenda.
I mean,
I've not seen any evidence. I would like to see
yeah.
more interviews with these people, what their rationale was.
Yeah, I mean, it's the logic of someone burning down their own house just to, just to
Yeah,
prove a point. It's almost
yeah,
got to that point,
absolutely.
isn't it?
But to these people, um, it's worth it because they are doing it for the greater good. These
Sure.
are the virtuous people that are trying to save the planet. You're just an evil denier. These are the virtuous people, and therefore they will justify anything. Anything is possible to justify their end goal. And their end goal is as far as I can see, going back to mud huts and living in the Stone Age. I think,
Yeah, they'd like that. By the way, just quickly on that, you'll notice they use the term denier because it's weaponized because it
Oh
equates
yes.
to Holocaust denial and all that kind of stuff. So
Oh
it's
yeah,
like
they love.
it's manipulation through language, basically.
Oh, all the time. Everything they
Yeah,
do is manipulating language.
yeah, yeah.
But this is not. Um, these forest fires are not just in America. We get them in Europe as well. So
Mm,
here is the European version. So we've got various different states here. We've got Spain, France, Italy, Greece, all of the hot areas around the Mediterranean, of course, all down the bottom. The one we really want to look at is the total,
mm,
which is the sort of light brown on the top, is the total fires. And this is data from 1980 up to 2020. So we've got 40 years of data here. And as you see, although they were complaining and shouting about the forest fires in Greece recently and the ones in Spain recently, just last year, the number of forest fires has actually been going down substantially. Okay, it's up and down all over the place, but if you put a line through there, um, it would go from 600,000 hectares down to about 300,000 hectares. So the number of the burnt acreage has halved
mm.
in 40 years. So rather than being correlated with CO2, it is anti correlated with CO2.
There's a big peak though
Uh,
in 2017.
yeah, but there's peaks all over the place. I mean, that's forest fires, isn't it? That's the variability in weather.
Mm,
But that's not climate. Climate has got to be over 30 years minimum.
mm,
So any single peak, that's just weather. You'll get that all the time. There's a big peak there in 1985 as well.
mm.
So if you have to do a smoothing operation if you're looking at climate,
Right.
and this is this is not a complicated graph. I could draw. Well, I could do that now, couldn't I? Let's.
So you have 30 years is normally a good time span to make it.
Yeah, climate is 30 years minimum.
Right. Okay, that's
Is what they
interesting.
say. That's the official definition of climate is
Well,
30
then
years.
that when they talk about the hockey stick, then they're justified, aren't they, by that rationale?
In what way?
Well, the hockey stick is like the last 30 years or so, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's been manipulated. I mean, the hockey stick is false.
Mm,
It was a stitch between two different data sets. The temperature data set has nothing to do
mm.
with the tree ring data set that precedes it.
Right. Okay. Okay.
So they jammed one upon the other. Just going back to
Yeah.
this burnt area chart, this is a nice straight line um,
Mm,
graph by the looks of it. So we can safely say that that is a good approximation of climate of more than 30 years of data. And it's a nice straight line all the way down from 600,000 hectares
mm.
all the way down to 300,000 hectares. And so that is climate. That is what the forest fires are doing in Europe.
Wow.
and it's anti-correlated to CO2. CO2, of course, has been rising all that time. So what this is saying, if they want to use forest fires, in their evidence, this is pure evidence that increasing CO2 stops forest fires.
That's what I was saying earlier.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's not because of extra CO2 that wouldn't stop combustion.
Yeah.
Um, it's just proving that their arguments are false.
Mm.
There's many reasons why these fires might be reducing. There might be, we now have water bombers and God knows what to put the fires out and all sorts of things. So
Yeah.
there's many reasons why these fires might be reducing. But there is no way from this data you can say that extra CO2 is causing more fires, because plainly it's
Mm.
not.
What about the rest of the world though? Is it a similar sort
I haven't got
of?
world
Okay.
data. I've only got
All right. Yeah.
America
Yeah.
and
Well, that's
Europe.
enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Bingo. Yeah, now
Yeah.
we're
Well
back again.
done. Yeah. Got through a lot there. Yeah. I wonder if there's anything to summarize. I know we summarized already, but to summarize the summaries,
Summarize the summary. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Mm.
basically, we're being lied to. So, if you're looking, do not get your climate data from the BBC or from CNN or any of those standard outlets. They are lying to you. We've shown the data, we've seen the graphs. They are lying to you. And even if they're not lying, they are cherry picking. So
Mm.
they are not giving you the full data. They might give you half the data, but not the full data, like in the forests where, they cut off the start of their graph because the rest of the graph is doesn't doesn't accord with the agenda.
Mm.
So you have to go. This is difficult because the problem is most people don't have the time to do their own research.
Mm.
I can do the research because I have an interest in this. I have lots of spare time. This
Yeah.
has become my sort of profession, as it were. Most people don't have that, so they have to get their data from a reputable outlet. And we don't have many of those left anymore. So you have to go to um, alternate outlets for the real information. You have to go to places like What's Up With That. Has been a long running website for a long, long time, has done a lot of the other information they will not give you. So that's called What's Up With That. It's the most watched
Mm.
internet site on climate in the world, I think.
Okay.
The other good one is Not a Lot of People Know That, which is very good,
Mm.
run by Homewood, I think his name is. There are a few of these. In fact, if you go on to the What's Up With That website, I think they've got a list of other websites who are
Credible.
skeptical, you might say. Yeah,
Yeah.
realists, climate realists, who will give you the other data. And then if you want, you can compare their data
Mm.
with the BBC data and make up your own mind as to who is telling the truth.
Yeah.
But I have done that on your behalf, and
Mm.
I can tell you that the BBC is not telling you the truth.
Yeah. I believe that. Can I ask just to wrap up then, like when did this start? Is this from like the Club of Rome and them talking about they need to instigate a crisis to be able to create a one world government? Is it all from that?
I think it's from that. And many politicians have fallen in line with that, even if they're not a one worlder themselves,
Mm.
because it's proved useful.